All right, good morning, everybody. So we can go ahead and get started. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat yet, feel free to do that. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions, and today we are going to be talking about preparing to defend your research. So during this presentation, I'm going to talk about both the proposal and the final defense. So we can go ahead and get started. So a little bit about Statistics Solutions before we get into the presentation. We are a full service dissertation editing and consulting company. So we provide assistance to graduate students through all phases of the dissertation. So all the way at the very beginning when you're deciding on what topic your dissertation is going to be about and forming your purpose statement and research questions, through to the proposal presentation, and then all the way through to the final defense. So if you are someone who is interested in having some more one-on-one assistance with those things, we do have some links in the chat. We'll also have our contact information at the end of the presentation, but feel free to contact us for that. We do offer a complimentary 30-minute consultation. So if you're like, I don't really know what I need help with, but I know I need help, that consultation is a great opportunity to talk through your research and identify areas where you may need some support throughout the process. So today we're going to be talking about the proposal, which is generally including chapters 1 to 3. So your intro, your literature search, and your methodology. We'll also be talking about the defense. So the full presentation all the way through your results and your discussion. I'm going to go through the components for each of these presentations, and then we'll go over some general tips for presenting your work and preparing that work for presentation. And then at the end here, I will open it up for question and answer. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can pop those into the chat and I'll be sure to answer them at the end. So first, let's talk about the purpose of both the proposal presentation and then the final defense. In this initial proposal, so some of you may be in the proposal stage, some of you may be a little bit further along, but if you are in the proposal stage, at this point, what you are trying to do is explain to your committee and your reviewers what the research problem is. You also want to explain why is your research relevant? Why is the particular study that you're proposing important? And what is it going to be contributing to the field of research? And then you're also going to give a really good detailed description of how you're going to actually conduct the research you're doing. So how are you going to recruit the participants? What type of data are you going to collect? How are you going to collect that data? And then how are you going to analyze the data to answer the research questions that you're putting forward? Now, if you have already proposed your research and now you are in the final defense portion of this process, then you're going to summarize the information that you provided in the proposal. So we still want to know why is this research important? How are you doing the research? Still want to know all of those things. But the meat of this presentation is really going to be in the discussion. So the interpretation of your findings and really just explaining what you found throughout your research project, and then emphasizing your contribution to the literature. So where does this research study fit in with the greater pool of literature that's already been done on this topic, or potentially that will be done in the future? So what is your study kind of leaving future researchers with, or leaving the particular field that you're hoping to influence or the population that you are studying? What can they take away from this study? So the components of each presentation is going to be pretty similar. The main difference is that if you are in the proposal as opposed to the defense, you will conclude your presentation at the data analysis. So you can see here that the The proposal includes an overview, background, purpose of the study, research questions and hypotheses. Theoretical framework, we'll talk about this. It may not be applicable for every study, but if it is applicable for yours, you'll want to talk about that in the proposal. Your methodology, and then your data analysis. So this is really the, how are you conducting the research? So that should be included in the proposal. Now, if you are in the defense stage, you're going to include everything from the proposal in a more succinct fashion. And then you're also going to tack on the results, discussion, and the summary. So I will go through each of these components through some sample slides that one could use for their dissertation. So generally, you're going to begin the presentation with a title slide. You'll have the title of your paper, your name, the name of your school, whether or not you're doing a proposal or defense, and also your committee. One important thing to note here is I always recommend to students reach out to your chair and ask for a template or a checklist so that you know when you start to put your slides together that you are including all of the information that they're expecting you to include. Generally, this presentation will mimic or mirror your paper that you've written. So if you have a template for the paper, that may be a really good starting point to start to develop your slides. But always just make sure you know what their expectation is before you start working on your slides. That way you're not kind of making extra work for yourself and you're really hitting the points that they want you to hit. So after your title slide, you might go into an overview slide. So this might be just like an agenda of what you intend to present that day. So I recommend that you just have some brief bullet points showing what you're going to be presenting. And then here's just an example. So you might have, background, current study, methodology, proposed analysis, and then questions. So that is an example that might be appropriate for the proposal, right? Because we're ending at the proposed analysis. If you are in the final defense, you might include some more bullets. But generally, these can just be the headers of each slide that you're going to be proposing throughout the presentation. Next, you are going to go into the background and the literature that kind of prepared you for this research. So in this section, you should define any basic terms. Whatever you're studying, you are probably very familiar with it, but as you're presenting this, you kind of want to, or you don't want to assume that the readers or the listeners know what you're talking about. So if there's any terms in your study or any terms related to your topic area that may not be apparent, I recommend defining those early on so that everybody knows what you're talking about throughout the presentation. This also might be where you introduce acronyms. So if you're going to be using maybe an acronym frequently throughout the presentation, you can set the foundation here and just make sure everybody is aware of what that is so that throughout the presentation, there's no confusion about what you're talking about. Next, you should summarize the research on your topic. So at this point, you may have conducted a literature search. Here's where you'll bring that literature back in and really explain what has been done on this topic, what the gaps in the literature are, so what hasn't been done, and how all of that information has led you to form your study. So, what do we already know about this topic that has kind of led you to believe that additional research is needed for this particular topic? And then through that, you're going to be highlighting the need for your study. So you're explaining, this is what's been done, this is what has not been done. And because of all of that, I need to do this study to further understand XYZ. So kind of just explaining how the research has evolved over time, what the current state of the research is, to give that reader some context for, your thought process behind your study. And this can be done on multiple slides for the purposes of the example today. I have it all on one slide, but you can have maybe 1 to 3 slides where you're really digging into that literature. And this is also an important piece to remind you all that you really need to have a solid foundation and understanding of the current literature to form a defendable research question or to form a really comprehensive study. So I recommend saving, like a table of evidence where you are taking notes on each paper that you're reading as you do your literature search, and just having that information available to you. It'll just make it a lot easier when you go to put together your slides. Something I like to do is after I read a paper, I just write a few bullets in my own words of the key takeaways of that paper, and then that can be easily moved over to the slides once it's time to start putting the slides together or writing your paper. So once you have explained kind of the scope around the current topic that you're wanting to study, you're going to go into the study purpose and also the research problem. So the research problem is what drives the study. And in order to really set up that research problem, you have to have that in-depth knowledge of the literature to understand, what are the issues, what is needed around this topic. Once you have determined that research problem, you can succinctly write your study purpose statement. So I put 2 examples on the screen here of what you might write for a qualitative versus a quantitative purpose statement. In the qualitative purpose statement, you should be identifying the research design. So you might say the purpose of this case study, for example, if it's qualitative, was to or will be. So if you are in the defense, you will use past tense. If you are proposing your research for the first time, you should be using future tense. And then you want to say what exactly you're studying, and you'll want to encode that study with specific language related to your research design. So in qualitative research, each of the designs kind of carries different language. So for example, if you're doing a grounded theory study, the purpose of the grounded theory study is to develop a theory. So here you might say to develop a theory about, and then you would plug in your central phenomenon and some information about your participants and maybe where they're situated. So you could say to develop a grounded theory about giving birth among Black women in the United States. So that's just an example of what you might say. Now, if you're doing a quantitative study, it's going to be a little bit different because, of course, the research designs that you plug in will be different, and the language around a quantitative purpose statement is also different. So whereas in qualitative studies, we're wanting to describe, explore, develop theories, and really kind of get at people's perceptions and feelings, in a quantitative study, you are going to be a little bit more specific because, you're doing some hypotheses testing. You're going to be determining whether or not your null hypothesis is true or false. So in those cases, you might say identify, examine, compare. So some more specific language. And then you'll just want to name your independent and dependent variables and potentially any covariates that will be included in the study. And then also you'll plug in your participants and the setting if it's appropriate. So once you have identified your purpose statement, you can go on to talk about your research questions. So what are the actual questions and hypotheses that your study is going to answer? If you are conducting a study that is quantitative in nature, you can use, in addition to the research questions, you will need to provide your null and alternate hypotheses. So you may use annotation like this. I recommend that whether your study is quantitative or qualitative, you separate out your research questions by slide. That way you can really explain per research question what information has led you to develop this particular research question, and kind of just section those out. And then as you're presenting these research questions, you may want to use visual aids, maybe some graphics to help the the readers and the listeners really conceptualize what it is that you're going to be testing. Next, you might move on to your theoretical framework. So typically dissertations are underpinned with some sort of theoretical framework. If you are doing a grounded theory study, I would say that's the exception. In the grounded theory study, you're generally going to be developing your own theory, so you may not have a framework to begin with. But in this slide, you will just want to identify the theory by name and then talk about what it was developed for, the utility of it. So what is this theory typically used for? And then how this theory interacts with your study. So here I'm just including a sample theory. So the ecological model is commonly used in public health or psychology. So you might say that, this is the theory that is guiding your understanding of these variables or your conceptualization of your study. And then you'll just talk about this theory in depth, depending on what your study is and what theory you're using. Next, you will go into your methodology and your research design. And the main purpose of this slide is to present the type of study you're doing, and then to also justify that study selection. So in terms of research methodology, you might be doing a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method study. You'll want to identify which one you're doing, and then also explain why this study is best suited for your research. So generally that justification should be rooted in the purpose statement and the research questions of your study. So again, if your study is looking at perceptions, feelings, things like that, motivations, maybe developing a theory, a qualitative study is probably most appropriate based on those research questions. If your study is really wanting to look at maybe like mean differences or associations or anything that lends itself toward looking at numerical data, then a quantitative study is most appropriate for your study. So you will want to explain that here. Why did you select quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods? Then you'll do the same thing for your research design. So this first bullet just has some examples of quantitative studies. So you might do a correlational study, experimental, quasi-experimental, something like that. And then the second bullet has examples of qualitative studies. So case studies, grounded theory, phenomenology. These are examples of qualitative research designs. So again, you will want to explain why the particular design you've selected aligns with the purpose statement and the research questions that you have put forward in earlier slides. So, for example, if you are conducting a qualitative study and your research question is to understand the lived experiences of Black women who give birth in the United States, a phenomenological study would be best suited for that particular research question because the purpose of phenomenology is to look at lived experiences. So that's some language that you might use to provide that justification. And again, if you're at the stage where you're putting your slides together, then you may have already, explained all of this in your paper. So now it's just a matter of moving that over to the slides. Next, you will continue your methodology by talking about the variables that you're going to be studying. So here on the slide, I have a quantitative example. In this case, I'm defining the independent and dependent variables that are going to be studied through this research. So in this case, we are looking at body mass index as a dependent variable, and this is going to be measured categorically with each different BMI range being categorized, as underweight, normal, overweight, or obese. You may also want to include how this is being measured. So you might say, I will be measuring the BMI of participants directly, or if you're doing some type of secondary data analysis, it may be that you are pulling this information from an existing data set. I'm also presenting the independent variables. So in this case, the independent variable is physical activity. This is going to be measured as a binary variable where people either did not engage in it over 1 week or they did engage in physical activity over 1 week. So this slide here is going to help the listeners understand what exactly it is that you're studying. So for example, in your research question, you might say, let's see, the purpose of this research or this research question is to understand the association between depression and physical activity. So from that, we know that your two variables of interest are depression and physical activity. But as you've all probably realized, as you conduct your literature searches, these variables can be defined in a million different ways. One researcher might use like the patient health questionnaire to define depression. Another might define depression as whether or not they're taking medication for depression. So here you just want to be really clear on how it is your study is going to be defining these variables. And this is largely going to be based on what's available to you. So, what instruments you're using for your study, and maybe even how the variable has been measured in the past. Maybe you're just going to be using a previously used definition for the variable. But overall, here you just want to define exactly what is the variable, how is it measured, and what data is going to give you the information for that variable. And this should be for each of your research questions. So if you have 4 research questions and you're looking at 8 different variables, then you want to make sure that you operationalize each of the variables that you're studying. Next, you are going to talk about your participants and your sample size. So you may have a statement like the one that I have on the screen. The sample size will consist of X participants, and then you'll want to talk about how you determine the sample size. So the sample size was determined by X. Here you're going to talk about not only the sample, but the population. So remember that the population is the larger group that your study is making inferences about. So in my example of understanding the lived experiences of pregnant women, Black pregnant women who give birth in the United States, for a study like that, we know that I will probably not be able to interview every Black woman who gave birth in the United States. So for that reason, I'm going to be drawing a sample from that greater population. So here in this slide, you might talk about that greater population and provide some demographic information about that population. So maybe for the example that I said, I might say the mean age of women in that subgroup. I might talk about how many times they've given birth. And this is just to give the reader an idea of who it is that you're going to be studying. Next, you'll talk about who it is that actually participates in your study. So we mentioned who the population is. If you are in the proposal phase, you will talk about your intentions, right? So you intend to recruit X amount of people from this sample, from the population. And you may talk about how you intend to recruit them. So will you be distributing flyers at a local hospital, for example, if you're looking to recruit pregnant women? Will you be kind of posting on Facebook? Will you be reaching out to individuals who have access to those participants? So just kind of thinking through what the best recruitment method is for your study, and then how you'll be collecting that data. So will you be using a paper and pen survey, or maybe you'll be using a web-based survey like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey? So just identifying how it is that you're going to collect the data and how you're going to connect with those people in order to conduct your study. If you are in the defense, the final defense, at this point, you're just going to be reporting back on who your study was. So you most likely have some sort of demographic table in your paper. You may just provide a high-level summary of those demographic characteristics of the people who were included in your study. If you are doing a quantitative study, then sample size is going to be a pretty important consideration here because we want to make sure that, or we want to understand the generalizability of your study. So if you are proposing this research for the first time and it is a quantitative study, you might conduct a power analysis to determine how many participants should be included in the study. So in this slide, you might present the findings of that power analysis to explain how you determined your intended sample size. If the study is qualitative, then you wouldn't necessarily conduct a power analysis, but instead you would rely on past literature to determine what the best sample size is for the particular qualitative research design that you're using. So if you are proposing your qualitative study, I recommend looking into the literature and seeing, for example, if you're doing a case study, typically how many participants are required for a case study type of research design. Now, if you are defending your qualitative sample size, then you may want to talk about data saturation. So you may want to say, or, review your data and see, were there any new themes that were emerging from the data after a certain amount of participants? So in that case, you're just trying to see, did I reach saturation? Did I collect all of the information that there was to collect related to my research question? And then you may say, your justification for your sample size is it was sufficient to reach data saturation. So once you've talked about who is going to be in the study, you may want to describe the process that the participants are going to be going through to participate in your study, and also talk about any data collection techniques and data sources that are going to be included. So here is a basic example. So in this study, participants are recruited through a partner site. So for my example, that might be a hospital, maybe a mommy and me class. So they're recruited through the partner site and also through social media. Then participants are funneled through to be screened by the researcher. Once they're screened, if they're determined to be eligible, they go through the informed consent process. And once they consent to participate in the study, they participate in the study procedures. So in this case, we have a demographic survey, BMI measurement, and then a survey of depressive symptoms. So you may present something like this. If you are doing a study that requires specific instrumentation, so maybe like the Beck Depression Scale or various validated scales, here you'll also want to name the scales and talk about the validity and reliability of those scales. So that's information that you can pull from the foundational literature around those scales. And this is just going to make sure that as you're presenting this information, you're showing that you have selected instrumentation that makes sense for your particular variables, right? So we want to make sure that whatever you're using to measure depression is truly a valid and reliable measurement of depression. So you'll just want to present those things here. If your study is qualitative, you most likely won't be using a scale. Instead, you might be using an interview protocol or a focus group protocol, or maybe you're going to be looking at some documents or conducting participant observations. So in that case, you would talk about the way that you developed your data collection for that study. So if you're using an interview guide, you may talk about how you developed that interview guide and how long you anticipate the interviews would take place if you're proposing, or if you are defending, you can firmly say how, on average, how long your data collection events took place. And then again, you also want to talk about the inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. So if you are doing a study, maybe of pregnant women, what criteria would make them not eligible for your study? That kind of gets into this screening piece. You know, how are you verifying their eligibility for the study? And, you know, how are you making sure that the people that you are including are going to give you information that is important and relevant to the study that you are conducting? So then just a few tips on the methodology. So this should be a very detailed section. I always recommend before you start writing the methods chapter or working on the slides to just go through and create a bulleted list of everything that you expect to do during the methods. So all the way beginning from getting your IRB approval, so the Institutional Review Board, making sure that you get any permissions to recruit. Each of those little steps is important. Also, how you are reaching out to participants, how they are reaching back out to you. So it could be something as simple as, you know, you distribute a flyer with your email address and interested participants contact you via email, and then you follow up with them also via email. Little things like that. Just important details to include to ensure that there's no gaps in your methods and there's no question as to how you're going to collect this data. So a few things that you may want to include are how the data is collected. So it could be that you are collecting online, maybe, or in person, whether you're doing like a virtual interview over Zoom, or you're doing a virtual survey that you've sent out over Qualtrics or something like that. Or it could be in person. So maybe you're interviewing people in person, or maybe you are handing out surveys by, you know, paper and pen, and you're collecting the data that way. You also want to talk about the frequency and the order of the data collection events. So some studies may require multiple data collection events. Maybe you are conducting a pre and post survey. So you're going to give participants a survey at time point 1 and then time point 2. It's important to be clear about what survey instruments are administered at each time point, and then what the space of time between those time points is. So that's important to include, and you may want to provide some type of visual aid to kind of help, you know, help the listeners clearly see exactly what that study procedure is. And then if there's any follow-up procedures that you're going to be conducting with participants, so sometimes in a qualitative study, you might use member checking, where you are reaching out to participants and asking them to confirm kind of what you found, or confirm the transcripts to ensure that it's like reflecting what they're saying. So if there's any follow-up procedures, you will also want to explain that in the methods. And then you'll also want to talk about your data management. So it doesn't need to be a very extreme data management plan. Like, you know, it can be as simple as the data is stored in a secure file on the researcher's computer, or the data is kept in a locked file cabinet, something as simple as that. But just thinking about, you know, how are you maintaining the confidentiality and the anonymity of your participants through secure data management plans. So you may also want to talk about that here. So once you've gone through all of that, you will go into your data analysis. So in the proposal, this is going to be kind of theoretical, right? So we're saying how we intend to analyze the data. And then if you are defending, you are going to explain, report back how you analyze the data in your study. The main takeaway that you should leave your your reviewers with in this slide is why the analysis plan that you've selected is most appropriate for your study and for the data that you've collected. So, for example, if you're doing a quantitative study, you want to make sure that the analysis that you've selected aligns with the level of measurement for each of the variables in your quantitative study. So whether you're doing a chi-square test or a t-test, just make sure you know, should I have a categorical variable, a continuous variable, and then you're doing the right study for that type of analysis or statistical tests. Then if you are in the proposal at this point, that would conclude all of the content around your proposed research. So you would conclude with a summary of the major points that you want the the reviewers to take away from what you've presented. So you would end your presentation. And then you might take questions and you also will probably thank your reviewers. So that would conclude the proposal. I'm going to go on to talk about the additional slides that you would include in a defense presentation. Okay, so once you have gone through all of that information, now if you are defending, remember that it's probably information that your reviewers have already seen in your proposal. So you want to include all of those slides, but you may modify them slightly to kind of summarize each of those points rather than, you're not proposing at this point. Now you're reporting back. So you can really just explain what you did and why it was appropriate as opposed to kind of exploring more in depth for the proposal. So here you're just summarizing chapters 1 through 3, and then going into the results and the discussion when you're defending. So in the results section of your defense presentation, you have some options, whether you are doing a quantitative or a qualitative study. I recommend that if you're doing a quantitative study, you present your results by research question and hypothesis, and potentially one slide per research question so that it's very clear how you have responded to each of the research questions. And in your results, you'll basically just want to say whether or not your hypotheses were supported and provide the statistical information or the findings of any statistical tests that you've ran to answer those questions. So here I would recommend looking into the standard way to report tests based on APA. I always look it up when I'm writing just to make sure I'm including the relevant variables from the output. So for example, if you are running an ANOVA test, you may want to report the degrees of freedom, the value of the F statistic, and then also your p-value. Whereas if you're doing a t-test, you'll want to report the t statistic. So, just make sure you're reporting the correct numbers from your output here in this. You may also want to report confidence intervals if it's appropriate for your study. So I always just recommend look up your particular research design and APA reporting to make sure that you are including what's important to include. Then if you're doing a qualitative study, rather than presenting your results by theme, by research question, I recommend reporting them by theme. So typically you'll have a number of themes or sub-themes that you've developed through your analysis. So you might have on slide 1, theme 1, and then slide 2, theme 2, and so on. With the qualitative, it's a kind of up for some flexibility. It really depends on how your study is structured and what makes the most sense. So it may not make sense for you to discuss by theme, depending on how you have kind of written your results. Then you will go into the interpretation of the findings. So through those interpretation of the findings, this is where you can really be creative and bring in your content knowledge and also your knowledge from the literature search. So you will want to think about your findings as like an island and then determine what connections does that island have to other papers that have been done. So are you supporting previous literature? Are you adding something new? So have you found any novel findings, or did you flat out not find anything that others have found? So maybe you found the complete opposite from previous research. So you'll want to talk about that and highlight any potential novel findings that you found. So if there's anything new that you found, that may have implications for future research. So you'll also want to talk about that here. Then you will go into the conclusions. So through those conclusions, you might want to talk about the implications for practice. So, what can people who read your research take away and implement based on these findings? So for the example that I gave earlier regarding experiences giving birth, maybe the findings from that study can influence future interventions to improve giving birth in U.S. hospitals. So kind of just thinking creatively about, what are you hoping to change? What are you hoping to influence through this study? And based on what you found, how can you create a plan for that? And then if you have a study that is using a theoretical framework, you may also talk about how the findings that you've generated coincide with that theoretical framework. So for example, earlier I presented the ecological model. That's generally talking about, the different layers that impact a person. So individual layers, social layers, and things like that. So I might say, through my research, I found that school settings influence students in these 4 ways. And I might tie that back into that theoretical framework, kind of explaining how the theoretical framework is in alignment with the findings through the study. Once you have talked about your conclusions, you may go into your limitations. So generally, these limitations can be about any part of the study. So here on this slide, I specifically wrote about data collection limitations. One good place to start for your limitations is going to be your research design, because each research design has standard limitations. So for example, a correlational study does not determine causation, so that's a potential limitation for that. So you may want to look into the particular study design that you used and write down some of the hallmark limitations for that particular design, and then report those back here in your presentation. You may also want to think about any challenges or shortcomings that may have affected the results of your study. So if you were not able to reach a certain sample size, if you lost data, if you, a common one is people wanted to collect data in person, but then during the pandemic, they weren't able to do that. So they had to move to remote data collection, and that may have impacted sample size. Or if you're doing a qualitative study, it may have even impacted the kind of the flow of conversation because of being over Zoom. So kind of just thinking through, what went on in your study that you would identify as a limitation, and how can, maybe how can it be corrected in future iterations of this study. So you'll also talk about the strengths and the future directions of the study. So you may want to talk about the generalizability or the trustworthiness of your study to highlight the strengths. Sorry about that. So the generalizability is largely going to be based in your sample size and how representative your sample is of the population. If your study is quantitative, those are considerations that you'll want to take into account. If it's qualitative, then your generalizability will not be tied to your sample size, because qualitative studies are smaller, have smaller sample sizes. So instead, you might talk about the trustworthiness. So how did you ensure that you weren't injecting researcher bias into your interpretation of the data? That's something that you might discuss. Or how are you ensuring that participants are kind of freely and openly describing their experiences? So those are some things that you might talk about. And then in future directions, this may kind of hinge on what you've already discussed in terms of weaknesses, and also the findings, any novel findings that you found. So in the future directions, you'll want to talk about what you might change. So maybe different designs or different sampling strategies. And also talk about if there's any findings that you found that you think warrant future research. So if you have a novel finding or an inconclusive finding, those are great opportunities to propose additional research be done to kind of really get down to understand, why is this inconclusive? Or if this is the first time this particular association has been found, how can we continue to study this particular association, maybe in different populations? So really kind of just creative and think about what the next step in this research is. So once you've done that, all of the content related to your presentation will be through. The next step will be to open the floor for questions. So you can invite your reviewers and the audience to ask questions. And then you'll present your references. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to just present a few tips for preparing. So I already spoke about this earlier, but I always recommend to follow the school's template if it's available. If it's not available, even just looking on Google to see how others have structured their presentations. Specifically, I think for thinking about visual aids that might make it easier to understand your presentation, it can be helpful to see the different ways that people do that to give you some ideas for yourself. A big recommendation I have is to reread foundational articles related to your topic. When you get into your proposal or your defense, you want to feel really solid in your understanding of the current literature. It's going to help you field questions. It's going to help you feel confident in what you're proposing or what you have done for your research. So I recommend having those kind of key takeaways from the foundational articles in your back pocket, whether that be on an index card if you're presenting in person, or if you're presenting via Zoom in the notes section of the various slides that you're going to be presenting. And then, of course, I recommend practice as much as you can, both by yourself, where you're just timing yourself, or in front of a mirror to watch your body language, see if you have any tells, or if there's anything that you can do to really make sure that you are communicating effectively. So not covering your mouth or not fidgeting too much, making eye contact with the audience. These are all things that are gonna make the information come across a little bit smoother. Also, verbal crutches, it can be so challenging. I know for myself, is a verbal crutch. So also thinking through some of those verbal crutches and try to catch yourself so that you're not making them, or you're limiting the amount that you are doing those things. I recommend presenting to family, friends, and your cohort members. I think it's helpful to present to people who have no idea about your topic. That's going to help identify any areas where you aren't being clear. So in that case, family and friends would be good candidates to present to, because if there is a slide that makes no sense, or they're like, what is the definition of this variable? I don't understand what this variable is. That's going to give you the clue that you need to go back and add additional detail. And then cohort members are also great to present to because they do have, that greater knowledge or more knowledge than your family or friends might have about the topic. So they can help you think through some of the more technical pieces. So maybe your analysis plan doesn't make sense, or maybe they themselves have presented their proposal or their defense and they have some pointers on how you can best do that. I think the biggest tip that I always give is to anticipate your questions and prepare backup slides. So when I always like to have a few backup slides at the end of the presentation that provide a more in-depth description of different pieces of the presentation. Remembering here that you don't have, unlimited time, so you may not be able to get into everything as deep as you want, but you can have those slides on the back end and bring them up throughout the question section. So one example, for my personal experience, when I presented my thesis, the sample that I was studying was not a very diverse sample. It was mostly individuals of high socioeconomic status, and they were mostly white. And so one of the questions my reviewers asked was, how can this information be looked at in other populations, because this sample is not representative. And so for that, I pulled up a different slide with a sub-analysis of the individuals in the sample that I used that were more diverse. So just kind of anticipate some of the weaknesses in your presentation and have some slides ready to say, that's a great question. I thought about that as well. Here's what I came up with. Now, it's important to note that you do not need to have an answer to every question. It is okay to say, thank you so much for that question. That isn't something I considered, but I think that would be a great direction for future research, or I think that would be a good additional analysis for us to conduct. So, you can kind of take recommendations. You don't have to be so reactive in your responses to questions. Sometimes if it's really something you haven't thought about, it's okay to say that and kind of put that in the parking lot for next steps in your research. Regarding your slides, I recommend not being too text heavy on the slides and really just using them to highlight key points, and then expanding with what you're saying out loud. So you may have really detailed notes in your slide notes, and that's, for me, when I present like academic work, I normally try to write myself a script with some talking points that I plan to hit on. And then on the slides, I just put a high level bullets regarding those things. So you may do that as well. Keep those very detailed descriptions in your back pocket and make your slides less wordy. Graphics can be a very helpful tool to help everybody understand what you're saying or to break up the text on the slides. So you can use those, but I just recommend making sure that they are appropriate for what you're trying to convey. So don't just throw graphics in for the sake of it. Make sure they're really contributing to the meaning of what you're sharing. And then going along with kind of working with your cohort members, it can be helpful to attend other candidates' presentations. It can be a little time consuming, but if you have the opportunity to watch somebody else present their research before you do, it's definitely worth the time to understand what you're going to be walking into. And if you don't have time to go to a cohort's presentation, you might be able to just look one up on YouTube just to kind of see what it is that you're going to be experiencing when you go through it. After your references slide, you might you might have a thank you slide for your reviewers, your family, your friends. So that might be something that you also include for both the proposal and the defense, just thanking the people that have invested the time and have helped you get through this process. So this slide concludes what you would include in your presentation. At the end here, I'm going to take question and answers, but I also want to highlight a few resources from our website that I think may be helpful to you all as you are going through the dissertation process and as you're starting to put some of these pieces together. So we do offer a number of complimentary resources. Here I've included a few blog posts, webinars, and different resources that might be helpful. So you will receive a copy of these slides, so you'll be able to click these links if you are interested. But again, we help with all of the chapters, so we have content related to each of the pieces that may be helpful to you. So a few that I'll point out here, we have a blog post regarding the presentation of your defense, a blog post about, what to expect with dissertation consulting, what even is this? How do we work with you? We do have a blog post dedicated to that. We have a template related to data analysis plans. So if you're not sure what the most appropriate technique to analyze your data is, we can help out with that. There's also a number of free resources. So I just popped in the link to our free resources toolbox. I believe in there we include a power analysis calculator. So if you are doing a quantitative study and you need to conduct a power analysis, that may be helpful for you. We also talk about theoretical frameworks in a blog post and how to really pick a theoretical framework and how to integrate that into your study. And then resources 6 through 8 are just related to your methodology. So putting together your methods chapter, identifying what is feasible and appropriate for your study. And then just the last two are related to analysis and then just overall getting through this dissertation process, because we know that it is a long process. So I hope that some of these resources are helpful to you all as you continue on in your journey. But now I'll open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If you do not have questions, thank you so much for joining today, and we hope to see you in our upcoming webinars in November.